We'll open your Bibles to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. Good to see everybody back tonight. Hope that you had a good afternoon. As I mentioned this morning, we've got a number of things coming up over the next couple of weeks. Just a few reminders of things coming up immediately. Number one, young people and parents, don't forget Youth Devo tonight after services at the home of Jimmy and Verley Young. Come on out. Even if you weren't planning on coming, come on out anyway. We always have plenty of food. And we'll enjoy that time together immediately following services tonight. Tomorrow night, Summer Youth Series begins. And if you are going to ride the bus, I know there's several that's just going out there since it's out at Glendale. But if you're going to ride the bus will leave here at 6:20. So if you're planning on riding the bus, please be here by 6:20 so that it can leave on time and get out there in plenty of time to start. Also, I mentioned this morning, next Saturday, for those who would be available and willing to go help, we'll be having a work day out at the camp. It'll just be a few of us and a few from Glendale doing some cutting down trees and brush and filling in some holes with dirt and doing some other dirt work. So if you could come and help us with that, we'll leave here at 8:30. And if you have chainsaws or axes or shovels or any of the above, bring any or all that you have. And the more we have, the more we can get done and the quicker we can get it done. So if you can come help with that, we'll leave here at 8:30 Saturday morning. And then Bible school is a week from tomorrow. It's hard to believe it's coming up that quick. Take a look, a walk around the classrooms, and they're not all done, but there's been an incredible amount of work done by the teachers, getting their rooms prepared and getting their literature ready. And they do a lot of work that sometimes you don't necessarily see unless you kind of venture back there into the classroom areas. But go back there and take a look. If not tonight, at least do so next week after Bible school one night and see the finished product. And I think you'll be impressed with how much work they all put into it and how much good it's going to do in the lives of a lot of young people and a lot of children. Plenty of postcards still out in the foyer. Please pick as many up as you can and use them. Let's get as many folks here as we can. We always have a good crowd, and we're looking forward to having another good Bible school this year. This morning I mentioned that tonight we were going to wrap up our May series on answering the question what it is we can do to be more effective and engaged and powerful in our attempts of reaching the lost in our evangelistic efforts. And as our subtitle indicates, we're trying to get to the heart of evangelism, beyond the collective efforts of the congregation, to what it is I, as an individual member, am able to do. And this morning we talked about some specific things, things that we can do on a daily basis, mechanisms, if you will, that would allow us to put them into practice and actually have a practical plan by which every day when we wake up and we leave the house, we have this mentality in mind, I'm going to try to do this today. Maybe we plan that I'm going to invite someone to church, or I'm going to plan to ask somebody a question that would hopefully lead into a discussion. Or maybe we leave the house with a mentality that I'm going to look for any open door that I can, and when that open door arrives, then I'm going to do whatever I can to take advantage of it. And that's where we talked about this morning, being inventive and flexible sometimes comes into play. I had mentioned though this morning that tonight I wanted to spend some time talking about some points that an individual made in an article that I had come across this past week in doing some study for the lesson this morning actually. It's, like I said, to my knowledge, not a New Testament Christian, and I wouldn't even go so far as recommending the website because honestly this is the only thing I've read on it, and so I can't vouch for any of the other material he has on there. So don't take anything that I'm going to say with regard to this particular article as a blanket of endorsement of anything this fellow whom I've never met before has ever written. I just think he made some pretty good points in this particular article that are going to do what we're kind of going to emphasize tonight, give us some perspective with regard to the work that we are trying to get done. Just for the sake of giving credit where credit is due, it is from a blog called Digital Sojourner. The fellow's name is Scott Thompson. And the name of the article simply is Practical Tips for Evangelism. Not really in the realm of mechanisms like we talked about this morning, though. Like I said, these are going to be more like questions that we need to ask ourselves, that if we will ask and answer in a proper way will help to give us some perspective with regard to how we can do our job as evangelists for God in a more capable way. Perspective and preparation. Wouldn't you say that those are really two key ingredients to success in any pursuit we have in life? We need perspective because it helps us to have a narrow vision of what we want to accomplish and how we're going to accomplish it. Preparation, of course we need preparation because that's the only way we're actually going to accomplish what we accomplish. And so what this article did, what this fellow did was he asked some insightful questions that would be good for us to ask in order to gain that perspective and be able to gather the preparation we need to be effective in the roles that we are trying to accomplish. I'm not really going to go through and read the questions as he worded them. I kind of grouped some of them together for our purposes, which basically fall under four general categories of questions we need to ask as we try to better prepare ourselves and get some fresh perspective stepping into the role of trying to seek and to save the lost. Why are we doing what we're doing? Why am I talking to someone about the gospel? Why am I studying the Bible so hard on my own so that I can study the Bible so hard with someone else? We need to ask and answer that question in order to get some perspective of what we're doing. Question number two, who are we trying to reach? Not necessarily a question of demographic, but a question of background. What do I know about the person or the people that I'm trying to reach with the gospel, and how can that information better enable me to do some good in their life? Number three, what complications can I anticipate? A complication that is anticipated is already half solved. And so if we can beforehand anticipate whatever problems, whatever roadblocks we might potentially face, then we'll be that much more prepared to face them when they come. And then question number four we're going to talk about tonight is how hard should I push an individual at any particular given point in time? Sometimes maybe I feel like I need to push a little bit harder in the moment, while other times maybe I feel like I need to back off for the moment. How hard should I push? And we're going to talk about these four questions tonight quickly so that we can get the perspective we need, and when we get the perspective we need, we can be that much more capable of accomplishing the goal that we have, which is to reach the entire world with the gospel. And as a case study in answering these four questions, we're going to refer back to Acts chapter 17 a lot, because as I went through and I read through some of these insightful questions that he put before me, I kept going back to Acts 17 and the interaction that Paul had with the Athenians and the philosophers there at the Areopagus. And I saw a lot of application with regard to situations he faced, how he dealt with these questions in his own ministry, and how we can do the same today. So let's begin. Number one. What is the goal that I have as I study the Bible with someone? If my goal in talking to someone about the gospel is anything less or anything more than simply trying to help an individual come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, then, to be quite frank about it, I'm doing it for the wrong reason. Now, let me kind of explain what I mean there. Some talk with people about the gospel not necessarily because they're really interested in winning a soul. I've been involved in conversations that pretty quickly evolve into a conversation where you can tell easily that there's not really that much surface desire anyway on the part of either participant to really leave a lasting impression with someone and win their soul more so than just win a debate. And you know what I mean the difference is. There's a big difference between winning a soul and winning an argument. Winning an argument has to do with who? Who's the main focus of winning an argument? I am. If all I'm interested in doing is winning an argument, that's kind of a selfish pursuit, isn't it? I'm just trying to prove that I'm right. I don't care about whether or not they really accept it or not. I don't really care if they put it to practice, and therefore I don't really care about their soul. I just care whether or not I can stump them and prove that I'm right. No, if I'm studying the Bible with someone, if I'm talking about the Bible with someone and I'm just concerned about winning the argument, it's not about them and it's most certainly not about God. I have made that discussion about me. And my goal in discussing the Bible with an individual should never simply be to win an argument or win a debate. It should be to help that individual come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Now, case study, Acts chapter 17. You remember in Acts chapter 17 that Paul had come from Thessalonica to Berea, and then he came to Athens where he was going to wait for his co-workers to catch up with him. And you remember Luke painting that picture for us that as he entered into the streets of Athens, it says that his spirit was stirred up within him. That means he was troubled. And the reason he was troubled was because of what he saw around him. All of those altars and all of those tabernacles that were built in homage to those mythological gods. And he saw the confusion, what he called their superstition, their hyper-religious activity, and it troubled him to no end. And so he engaged in conversation with them. Now, in response to this question in terms of Acts chapter 17, you remember who he talked with most about the truth. In fact, what the city of Athens was primarily composed of, philosophers. By rule, what are philosophers typically interested in? In discussion, in debate, in argumentation, in pressing the veil as much as they possibly can, in pursuit of knowledge. Not necessarily that they'll accept, but just for the sake of obtaining knowledge. Athens was the central hub of knowledge in the first century. And you better believe those philosophers there were interested in knowledge and hearing something new, Luke wrote. And so when Paul first engaged them in discussion about the hyper-religious activity and the misguided religious activity that he saw around him, how easy do you think it would have been for Paul to fall into the trap of arguing with these people just simply for the sake of proving his point? or arguing with these people just simply for the hope of saving face with them, leaving a lasting impression with them so that they would remember who He was and when He came through town. But when you see Paul engage with these individuals in Acts chapter 17, you don't really see him doing any of that, do you? Now, he does engage them. He does initiate conversation. He does talk to them about the unknown God, unknown to them, whom they ignorantly worshiped. He wanted to declare Jehovah to them, and He did. He had an audience with some of the most learned and yet also some of the most ignorant people in all the world at that time, and He took advantage of that and He taught them the gospel. But notice what Paul does. He is brought to the Areopagus, this open-air theater where he would have the opportunity to make his case. He told them what they needed to hear. He made his point. He did so as capably as he could in hopes of trying to help someone come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And when you come to the end of Acts chapter 17, what do you find? Well, you find in the final verse that some believed. He accomplished what he hoped to accomplish. He reached some folks with that saving message of Jesus Christ. And no doubt he praised God for the success that God had had in Athens. Not that he had, but that God had had. But then the verse just previous to that, what other response did Paul have among those in Athens? Well, in that next to last verse in Acts 17, Luke just simply said, some mocked him, saying, well, we'll hear thee again of this matter. In other words, they wanted Paul to come back and argue with them some more. They wanted this back and forth to keep going so that they could just keep on arguing about it. And what did Paul do? He did what he felt he could do. He accomplished what he felt he could accomplish. He told them what they needed to hear, and he left. He had a goal. Reach someone with the saving message of Jesus Christ. He accomplished his goal. He felt as though he could accomplish no more as pertaining to that goal, and so he went on his way and tried to accomplish it somewhere else. But he was not going to stay behind and get into a mudslinging contest with a bunch of Athenian philosophers. As we go about our work in trying to be evangelists for God, question number one, we need to determine what's our real goal. What's our real motivation? I can tell you what it ought to be. You know what it ought to be, but only you can answer what it really is. Am I really interested in actually touching the heart of an individual with the gospel of Jesus Christ? Or am I more concerned with making sure they remember my name? Or am I more concerned with winning the argument? Am I more concerned with making them feel as though they are less than me? What's the goal? We answer that question, we're going to get a lot of perspective into what it is we are accomplishing. Number two, we need to ask and answer the question, who is it that we are trying to reach? And like I said before, this question isn't as much a question of demographic as it is a question of background, knowledge of the person or people that we are trying to touch. An age-old rule in reaching people with the gospel, I have found anyway, is this. Most often when you possibly can, knowing a person or people as much as you do, when you start talking to someone about the gospel, you have to meet with them where they are. Now what I mean by that is you meet them where they are mentally with regard to their knowledge, their understanding, and even, yes, their beliefs concerning God and concerning the Bible. And if you can meet them where they are, then you can use that as a launching point to, number one, determine what else needs to be discussed, but also where the conversation ultimately can lead. And so if we're going to reach a person, then as much as we possibly can, and I know circumstances a lot of times don't necessarily allow this, but as much as we possibly can, we need to know something about them. For instance, where does this person stand spiritually? What's their spiritual life like? Are they a pious, humble person? Are they someone who has some kind of religious background, or are they someone who's mostly worldly, doesn't really have much of a religious background, whether it be among New Testament Christians or even in any religion whatsoever? What kind of person is this individual spiritually? Does this person even believe in God? You know, you talk to someone who's an atheist, a person who's an agnostic, and a person who may not be a New Testament Christian, but they already at least believe in God, and you've got a different starting point for all three. And you can't necessarily treat all three individuals the exact same way as you begin talking with them about the Bible, because they're all at a different place mentally. What about this person's religious background? What religious baggage do they bring into the conversation, into this discussion? What denominational doctrines have infiltrated their minds? And how is that going to affect the way that we're able to openly and honestly talk about Bible doctrine? What does this person already know? And what do you have in common with them as far as belief? You don't necessarily agree on everything, which would indicate why you're studying the Bible with them to begin with, but you might find that there's a lot that you agree with them on and that they agree with you on. In fact, sometimes you may find that there's more you agree on than you don't. What are they really confused about? Where, in what particular areas do they really differ with what the Bible teaches? Because you certainly don't want to start getting into matters of opinion and trying to make them out as though they're Bible doctrine and confuse that even more. Where do they really differ with what the Bible teaches? And no doubt there's a lot of other questions or information that we could have about a person or people that we know that would help us in knowing who it is that we're trying to reach. But if we can get some information about them, if we know anything about them, then that gives us a great deal of advantage with regard to how we approach them and where the conversation ultimately leads. In Acts chapter 17, in our case study, you remember that Paul knew a little something about the Greeks, didn't he? Oh, in that short conversation he had with them there in Athens, you see a great deal of knowledge with regard to Paul and his knowledge of Greek culture, of Greek religious beliefs. He even quotes their poets on occasion. And you can imagine the impact that Paul's background knowledge of these individuals likely had as he addressed these individuals and was able to do so with a great deal of authority because of what he knew about them. Who is it that we're trying to reach? I hope that answer is complicated in a sense, because I hope we're trying to reach a number of different people. But whoever it is that we're trying to reach, what do we know about them, if anything? Because what we know about them can be a great, great benefit in how we approach them, where we start the conversation, how we deal with them, how complicated or simplistic we try to keep things, how hardline, in a sense, we try to be. And what I mean by that is, some people have a personality that doesn't lend very well to being really demanding and forceful, while others do. And I've seen a number of folks try to be very demanding and very forceful and put their foot down and use the stern voice and the beady eyes with someone who's just not going to respond to that. I'm not saying what they told them is not true, it's not right, it absolutely was, but the approach that they used just simply was not conducive to reaching that person. I like to think about Jesus in an example like this. Matthew chapter 23, you remember that Jesus had kind of a candid conversation with the Pharisees, didn't He? I mean, He told them some things they needed to hear, to be kind of simplistic about it. He used some, I'm not going to say harsh language because there wasn't anything wrong with what He said. In fact, there was everything right with it. But you see the way Jesus addressed the Pharisees in Matthew 23 and referring to them as hypocrites and a generation of vipers and ye blind guides that strain in a gnat, swallow a camel, and He used some language with them that was a little bit harsher than you would find in most of the other conversations that Jesus had with other individuals. And it's amazing to me to see the number of people who will immediately jump to just using that stern, forceful, foot-down approach with someone that they either don't know, have never talked to the Bible, talked Bible with before, or whatever, have very little background with. And justify it by referring to Jesus in Matthew 23, when Matthew 23 was nowhere near Jesus' first interaction with the Pharisees. They had met before and had somewhat of a background. And that lended Jesus the opportunity to be a little bit more forceful with the Pharisees than He would have been with really anybody else. We need to use a little bit of discretion, a little bit of common sense in the way that we approach individuals based on who they are and what type of people and what kind of personality that they have. So what's the goal I'm trying to accomplish? What's my real motivation in talking to someone about the Bible? Who is it I'm trying to reach? What do I know about them that can help me touch them in some way? What do I know about them that will help me approach them in a more capable and effective manner? Question number 3. What roadblocks am I going to face? Because, folks, it's not a matter of whether or not I'm going to face roadblocks. It's just simply a matter of what kind are they going to be. Ultimately, in our work as ministers of the gospel and active participants in the evangelistic process, we are going to meet skeptics. In fact, sometimes we'll meet them more times than not. And skeptics, we typically assume will immediately reject anything we have to say, right? If someone shows a hint of skepticism about what the Bible teaches, we immediately just assume they're just going to reject it altogether, right? But you know, skepticism doesn't necessarily mean rejection. There's really two kinds of skeptics we're going to face as we try to talk to people about the gospel. And number one, there's going to be what we call the intellectual skeptic. The intellectual skeptic knows just enough Bible to be very, very dangerous. You know, a little Bible knowledge is a very dangerous thing. And the intellectual skeptic knows just enough Bible for it to be dangerous. And what I mean by that is they know just enough that they think they know everything, and they have all the answers to all the questions, and you can't tell them anything. We're going to face folks who are intellectual skeptics, who know the Bible and think they know everything about the Bible, and as a result, anytime you tell them something that the Bible actually teaches that they don't accept, they're going to assume it's because you're wrong and they're right because they know the Bible. And so we're going to face intellectual skeptics. They have things figured out. and their objections are purely intellectual. On the other hand, you're going to, number two, have the emotional skeptic. You're going to have the person whose objections are based primarily on feeling, on the hurt that they have to experience at the idea that they might be wrong, and therefore others in their life, or who had been in their life, might be wrong as well. This type of individual typically has a lot of background in a particular religion or with a particular thought process, and as a result, it's difficult for them emotionally to admit that they might have been wrong, or that others in their lives might be wrong that they love. You're familiar with people like this. You've met them because you've talked to someone about the Bible, perhaps say about the issue of baptism. We're just going to throw this out there as a theoretical. You talk to someone about the biblical doctrine of baptism and how that plays into the necessity of us with regard to salvation. And a person uses this argument. You say my grandmama's lost? You saying my parents are in hell? See, they're not thinking intellectually. They're not thinking about what the Bible teaches in a rational way. They're looking at it emotionally. It is raw emotion, and it's based on feeling. And we're going to face people like that. In fact, we may face more emotional skeptics than we really do intellectual skeptics, but we're going to face both at some point in our lives. And the reason we need to know this ahead of time is because the background a person comes from and their rejection of truth is going to determine the way that we need to respond. You can't treat both situations necessarily exactly the same. They are unique, and they need to be handled that way. Back in Acts chapter 17, Paul anticipated the issues he was going to face in Athens. He knew that they were primarily philosophers, and that they were primarily interested, not necessarily in an open and honest evaluation of what was right in hopes of them accepting it, but just more so in the consumption of knowledge. And so Paul addressed them not to appeal to their emotions as much. When Paul preached that sermon from Mars Hill, you notice that he appeals to their intellect. He's talking to an intellectual group of people, right? Whose issues, whose skepticism is going to be rooted in intellect. And so he addressed them in that regard. When a person objects on the basis of emotion, I can't say that I know the best way to deal with that. We just simply have to try to help them overcome that emotion and help them understand that Bible doctrine doesn't have anything to do with regard to emotion or feeling. It has to do with objective truth. And while it may hurt, it may foster raw emotion to have to admit fault or realize that people that we've loved in years past didn't accept truth and therefore may be lost. We can't allow that to weigh them down. We have to help them push beyond the emotion and understand what truth is and be able to separate emotion from truth in that regard. Are there going to be other roadblocks? Absolutely. But he kind of mentioned a couple of those, and I thought that's so true. We face skeptics, and we face them primarily in those two areas, intellectual and emotional. And we've got to be able to distinguish between the two and kind of have a plan in our minds of how we can address either one of them, because we've got to do so in a much, much different way. Number four, knowing the goal, knowing the people or the person that we're trying to reach, anticipating the potential problems, we ask question number 4, how hard should I push on people at times when it comes to teaching them and encouraging them to do what's right? Now, honestly, to me, from the four that we talk about tonight, this is probably a little bit of the hardest to really put your finger down on. Because when it comes to something like this, we really walk a fine line pertaining to the pressure we either do apply or we don't apply. A lot of it has to do with how well we know a person, how long we have been studying with them, how long we've been talking with them, how much we've been able to see them develop, and kind of having an idea of where they are spiritually. Now, honestly, instinct helps a lot in situations like this. Because we fear pushing too hard at times, knowing that we could feel that we could make them feel like they're being pressured into something, and we could easily alienate them if we're not careful. At the same time, we fear twiddling our thumbs and dragging our feet. We fear taking too long because we know how urgent the call of the gospel is, and the reality that we never know how much time we have left. And so it's a very fine line. We don't always know how to deal with it. But back in Acts chapter 17, remember we talked about how that Paul, when he began this discussion with him, not at the Areopagus, but actually back in the streets of Athens, where the conversation began, he met the people where they were. He told them what they needed to hear. He helped the ones that he could help. He withstood the ones who mocked him, and he moved on. We can take a lot from that, or we can take a little. But ask yourself this question: could Paul have stayed in Athens? I mean, he apparently wasn't there that long, it doesn't seem. Could he have stayed? Could he have hung around in Athens a little bit longer and tried to push just a little bit harder on those who had mocked him? He could have. But this seems to be the mentality that Paul brought to his ministry. He seemed to have put a lot of stock in first impressions. And if someone left a first impression with him that caused him to believe he could do some good, he would hang around. I mean, he was in Corinth, 12 months, Ephesus 18 months. I mean, it wasn't like he was in and out of locations all the time quickly. He did hang around some areas for a lengthier amount of time. At other times, he was in and out. He would move quickly for the purpose of his ministry. It's really reminiscent of back in Matthew chapter 11. You remember that when Jesus sent those 70 disciples on the limited commission, He told them, go into a city, see what you can do. If they accept you, do what you can. If they reject you, what did Jesus tell them to do? Get the dust off your feet and move on. Don't waste time in an area pushing people who possibly and likely aren't ever going to respond favorably. There's a lot more people out there in the world who need the truth, and Jesus just simply said, shake the dust off your feet and move on and find someone else. Keep on doing good, keep on working, but sometimes you just have to move on. Because the more time you waste with someone who probably will never accept it is time that you've wasted that you could have spent with other people that would have more likely accepted it. So he could have hung around. He could have engaged those who had mocked him a little bit more and pushed him a little bit more and tried to do more there. But that first impression said a lot to him. And so when he did what he could, he didn't hang around and push. He just went on and tried to find somewhere else where he could be effective. Now that's not to say that at other times he didn't push a little bit harder. I think about King Agrippa there near the end of the book of Acts. You remember that Paul in talking about the gospel with Agrippa and talking with Agrippa about his soul, he said, King Agrippa, do you believe? I know that you believe. Those are words of Paul pushing him in a sense, not trying to pressure him beyond his own free will, but doesn't there seem to be a sense of urgency in Paul's words to say, Agrippa, I know where you are, I know what you believe, there's nothing that's stopping you. Why are you waiting? He did push Agrippa a little bit harder, but of course Agrippa wouldn't budge. He said, well, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And so sometimes Paul pushed, sometimes he didn't. He didn't in Acts 17. He did later in, Acts 24, Acts 25. It just depended a lot on who it was, what he knew about them, what more he believed could be accomplished. And we're just going to have to make the same decision at times ourselves. It's a judgment call. It's one that sometimes we'll get right and it's one sometimes we'll get wrong. There's no science behind it. And that's why this one's more difficult than the others that we've talked about tonight. There's not a science about it. I can't tell you absolutely beyond the shadow of a doubt, here you need to move on, here you need to push harder, here you need to push harder, and here you need to move on. Nobody knows for sure. We just simply have to make the best decision we possibly can and pray for the best in any circumstance. I hope that the series that we've had this month has helped in some way. It's helped me. I've really tried to study these matters, or in fact I have studied these matters, realizing that I've got to preach this to myself first. There's areas that I drastically need to improve on as well. And I'm not pointing a finger at anybody here without pointing one first at me. I really hope this information has been helpful and it's been motivating for us to perhaps evaluate what we haven't done as effectively before, maybe what we've never done before, and how we can improve on that and do more in the future. And if every single one of us could just simply make that commitment to see what more I can do, could you imagine what we collectively could accomplish? It would be amazing. But to do that, we need to get this perspective, and hopefully these questions will help us get the perspective and the preparation that we need to do that. Maybe tonight you're not a child of God. You've never made that commitment in your life, and if so, you're missing out on what will be the single greatest decision you ever make. And I plead with you to reconsider that, to decide tonight that you want to become a child of God. If you believe that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God and you're willing to turn from your sin in repentance, confess your faith and be immersed in water, because that's what God told us to do, then I sincerely hope you'll do that tonight. Not because I say it, not because this church teaches it, but because God said it, and therefore we teach it. And when we come to God on His terms, then He's promised He's going to bless us in ways unimaginable, most of which is eternally, giving us the anticipation and the hope of heaven as our eternal home one day. Maybe you've done that in the past and you are a child of God, but you've allowed sin to take a stranglehold on your life once more. And because of that, you're not living faithfully. You need to come back and come home. God offers us that opportunity anytime we have need. If we would turn from our sins in repentance, confess them, pray to Him for forgiveness, then He is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Tonight, if you're subject to heaven's invitation, please come now while together we stand and sing.